Welcome to Certain Point of Views Trade School, where each episode a different host talks about a comic book trade paperback that they loved and why they love it.
Hi, everybody. This is Jim from the Long Live the Legion podcast here for my episode of Trade School. So as the co-host of the Long Live the Legion podcast, a lot of people ask me, how do I get into the Legion? I'm interested in these characters. I want to understand more of them. I want to read more stories, but how do I actually get introduced to these characters? So the Legion has a very, very long history beginning in the 50s, and there are multiple origins, multiple versions of the Legion, for that matter, that need to be accounted for, and it's not that easy to just pick up and start reading and figure out who they are. Some people do that. So a lot of people say, read the Great Darkness Saga from the 1980s, which is a fantastic story, probably the most seminal Legion storyline ever created. But it's the equivalent of throwing you into a deep end of a pool and trying to figure out what's going on. Not impossible, right? Especially these days with the internet, and you can find out who the characters are just by looking them up. But it doesn't give you a sense of how the characters came to be, what their roles are, how they interact with each other, generally speaking. And so I like to take a little bit more of a nuanced approach for this. When you look at the Legion over its history, which is almost 60 years, there have been several versions. There's the original version that began in the 50s and technically ended in 1994. There were a lot of problems because the Crisis on Infinite Earths happened, and that essentially reset a lot of the DC continuity, including the fact that Superman was never Superboy, who was a inspiration for the Legion to be formed. That also created a lot of issues because the DC editorial staff said to the Legion creators, you cannot reference anybody from the Superman mythos at all, ever. And so that caused a lot of problems, and then continuity got all wonky, and people were confused, and sales started dwindling, and they had this 5 years later Legion where it was dark and gritty, and it became even more confusing for new readers. So in 1994, one of the things that DC decided to do to correct all the craziness that resulted from the Crisis was create Zero Hour, which was a storyline that effectively reset all continuity across the DC universe. The main beneficiary of this was the Legion of Superheroes. And what happened was every title across the DC universe had a zero issue. And the Legion at this time had two titles. They had the Legion of Superheroes and then the Legionnaires titles. For a lot of reasons I won't get into on this particular podcast, they had an older Legion and then a younger Legion, which was the Legionnaires, the clones of the younger selves of the older Legionnaires, basically. And when the 0 hour reset hit, they basically used this as a means of telling the origin of the Legion of Superheroes. So you had the Legion of Superheroes title itself, which they kept on numbering in the existing format, which was kind of a dumb move because they're effectively restarting the entire continuity. So why not start with issue 1? That's a whole other argument. And then you would have the Legionnaires story. So that you had effectively 2 stories every month, which was really, really good. For a Legion fan, especially if you're a new Legion fan, getting up to speed on who these characters are is fascinating. So what happened was, I guess I should say more recently, from a trade paperback perspective, they have released that first 6 months of Legion stories from the 0 hour, post-0 hour reboot as Legionnaires Book One. And what this does, this collects the first 6 months of the reboot Legion origin. It's highly recommended because it tells the story of the team's origin without these weird flashbacks that you get all the time in the previous iterations of the Legion. But you begin with the actual origin of the Legion, the saving of industrialist R.J. Brand by Imra Ardeen, Garth Rands, and Rock Kryn, who become the actual Legion of Superheroes, or at least the start of the Legion of Superheroes. And then from there, the story progresses to tell the recruitment of every other Legionnaire that joins that initial group. And it's a great, great story because you get to understand who these characters are. Everybody has a little bit of a spotlight. The core Trinity characters are obviously the more focused characters across the entire tale, but every new character gets a story. You understand why they're there, how they came to be there. It updates the tales in a little bit of a more modern take. It takes a lot of Silver Age tropes and Silver Age stories specifically and gives them a more modern twist. And helps show how these characters come to relate to one another. Additionally, we also get lots of new characters too. So as part of this new reboot, this is where we get the character XS from the Flash family, right? So this is the granddaughter of, the granddaughter of Barry Allen, because Dawn and Dawn Allen, who are the Tornado Twins, moved to the future, and they each had their own family. One child was XS, the other child was Impulse, who we also know from the mainstream DC continuity. We also have Kinetics, who is a kind of a magic user, mystical character in the telekinetic way of doing things, and she has a whole story around her about her quest for power to be useful, and there's a whole story around that, how her ultimate character fate was originally supposed to be one thing, but then the writers at the last minute did something else. We get our first glimpse of the awesome character Gates. We see Shrinking Violet, of course. We see Apparition and Leviathan, who is the cosmic boy or the colossal boy of the reboot. So lots of really good stuff here. One of the things that was really good about this is that the writing team and the creative team in general had this kind of separate retreat where they sat around and kind of really plotted out where they were going to take this book over the next couple years. So Mark Waid was kind of the lead person around this. And if you know anything about the Legion, you know that Mark Waid is a very, very, probably one of the most detailed minds about knowing as much about the Legion history as possible. So he was kind of shepherding this. And we had Tom Pyre, who's one of the writers, Tom McCraw, who's there as well. Casey Carlson was the editor of the Legion line at this time, and he's kind of shepherding all this together. And they really plotted out what this first year was going to look like. And this first 6 months, like I was mentioning before, is really the intro of the team, bringing them together and having them gel. The second 6 months is the Legionnaires Book 2 trade paperback. And that's where it starts kind of going onto its own. There's some retreads of some of the Silver Age stories, but there are a lot of very relevant stories that are relevant to the current day, right, with regards to our politics and things like that. And it's a very good read because it not only does it tell an original story with a lot of high stakes drama, but it also plants a lot of seeds for the next year of stories. And so you can really tell the care with which the creative team went to actually plot this out. So it's fantastic. From an art perspective, we begin with Stuart Immonen doing the first Legionnaires or the Legion of Superheroes issue number 0, which tells the story of the founding of the Legion, basically. And then the LSH title is then turned over to Lee Moder in some of his earliest work. But I guess from an art perspective, the thing that stands out the most is the fact that you have Jeffrey Moy on the Legionnaires side of the house. So Jeff was the Legionnaires artist from 1994 through 2000. And I think we've determined that he's one of the most, if not the most prolific Legion illustrator across the entire history of the Legion. And when, he has his own takes, very manga inspired. Some people weren't fans of the art at the time that it was released. And if you hear the term Archie Legion, that's where this came from. Originally, it was a little bit derisive, but now I think it's kind of been owned because it is very distinctive and it's very good. I mean, they look like 14-year-old kids, which is what the Legionnaires' ages are supposed to be. So I highly recommend this. It's a great, great story. Other than that, this is another good book to read from a Legion perspective because it's one of the only, I think it's the only Legion story, aside from maybe the Bendis Legion, which we're not going to talk about. We're having a good conversation now, right? But it's the only Legion story that really tells the story of the founding and how things kind of moved from there in a chronological kind of moving forward way where things happen in sequence and the past impacts the future and things like that. Very, very good. And it's because the Reboot Legion doesn't really have an origin story, which is the version that came out in 2005. The Retroboot Legions, which were the ones that happened while the Reboot was actually being published, as well as afterwards in the 2009 and beyond era into the New 52. Those never really had a specific origin story, but those really called back to the Silver Age stories and some of the retcons of all that stuff. So it didn't have its own story either. So from the perspective of what you want to read to get a handle on who the characters are in the Legion, how they relate to each other, how the team works, I'm recommending the Legionnaires Book One and even Book Two to get that flavor of what the first year of the post-Zero Hour Legion was like. And with that, I'm going to say long live the Legion. I hope to see you on the podcast at some point. We are at Long Live the Legion at Long Live the Legion 2025 at gmail.com, or you can reach us at Long Live the Legion 2025 at .bsky.social. And with that, I will bid you happy reading. Hey, Jay.
Hey, Jim.
You're a fan of the Legion of Superheroes, right?
Yeah, I've been reading their adventures for decades.
Me too. It was tough at first with all the characters, but now I think I'm an expert.
It's not too hard to get into the Legion. And to make it even easier, we have a podcast called Long Live the Legion. We talk about different aspects of all its history to help you out.
So whether you're a new reader in the Legion Academy, or have your own flight ring, or anywhere in between, a Long Live the Legion podcast should be on your playlist.
CPOV.
CertainPOV.com.